Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, ciao, bonjour, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hey, my name is Jet Lee. Welcome to Reading with Your Kids. We are coming to you from the beautiful, wonderful, oh, how historical neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so very honored and so wicked happy that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. We do that by sharing fun, thoughtful, and thought-provoking conversations with fascinating people who just happen to be writing books for kids of all ages. You can help in the mission by telling all of your family and friends about the show and letting them all know that they can find us on the WREB AM/FM 24/7 radio network. And they can also find us on the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, Podcast Addict, CastBox, Player FM, Boomplay, Ghana, wherever you find your favorite shows. We have a wonderful show for you today that I think will become one of your favorites. One of our favorite guests, Gabriella Aldeman, is here to celebrate Squawk of Spanish. And later, 17-year-old Michael Hoffen will be here to celebrate Be a Scribe. Before we invite our guests into the studio, we have a big announcement to make. We have a brand new Reading with Your Kids certified great read, Pisa Loves Bella. Delightful children's book written by Kimberly Lovato and illustrated by Barbara Bongini. From the very first lines, readers are introduced to Bella, the beloved Leaning Tower of Pisa, who proudly narrates her story in a charming, rhyming cadence. Bella's narrative is both engaging and heartwarming. For centuries, she has stood tall, albeit slightly tilted, and has been a source of pride for the residents of Pisa and a model for visitors worldwide. Her gravity-defying lean is what makes her unique and special. However, Bella's confidence takes a hit when she overhears some unkind remarks made about her appearance. This moment of vulnerability is a turning point in the story, leading Bella to make a drastic change that concerns everyone around her. The story beautifully conveys important themes with self-acceptance and kindness. Lovato's rhymes are memorable and flow effortlessly, making it an enjoyable read-aloud for children and adults alike. The Italian expressions sprinkled throughout add a delightful cultural touch, enriching the reading experience. Barbara Bongini's illustrations are a perfect match for Lovato's text. Splashed with joyful art, they bring Bella and her surroundings to life with vibrant colors, expressive details. I'm telling you, each page is a visual treat capturing the essence of Pisa and its famous landmark. You and your family are going to love this book. Get your copy today. Pisa Loves Bella, written by Kimberly Lovato. It is our latest Reading with Your Kids certified great read. Join us once again from Northern Virginia. Our guest is returning to Reading with Your Kids to celebrate her brand new book. It's called Squawk of Spanish. Please welcome back to the show, Gabriella Aldeman. Hey, Gabriella, how's it going?
It's going great, Dad. Thank you.
Great to have you back on. We had such a wonderful time talking about Paula's Patches a few months back, and also talking about beautiful Panama in Central America. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. The book is coming out in August, so in English and in Spanish, so I'm very excited about that.
I'm guessing you didn't have to go to another professional translator to get it into Spanish.
That's right. I had the honor to translate this book, and it was just a wonderful experience.
I'm curious, when you were writing this book and others, which language is the original manuscript in?
It's in English. It's really interesting because I grew up in Panama. My first language is Spanish. However, I did go to immersion school in Panama, so half of the classes were in English, and literature or English was in English. And so I had that. I always felt I still to this day, I say, I think I speak better in Spanish and write better in English because the majority of the books I have read are in English, even from a young age. And, when I write for not write for myself in terms of stories, but if I write in a journal, just writing out my feelings, it comes out mostly in English as well.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
I want to jump into Squawk of Spanish, but before we do, I'm curious, literature and written in English and Spanish, is it different? Are the stories told in different ways?
So that was a little bit of an obstacle to translate this particular book, because as you know, every book has its obstacles in translation. And when I wrote this book, Squawk of Spanish, and we'll talk about it later, but you can see how it would speak very, very much to a bilingual family. And early on, when I was just writing it, I was thinking, this would be great to translate in Spanish. And very quickly, I said, no, I think it's impossible. And when the publisher reached out and said, we know you're a professional translator. We have our own translators, but would you like, it's up to you to translate this book. I said, yes, absolutely 100%. I wasn't going to say no if this book was going to be translated, but I did have a moment of panic where I was like, it's written in English, but it has Spanish words sprinkled throughout. And it's about a boy telling us that he is struggling and he does not like speaking Spanish. So how do I do that in Spanish? And that was an obstacle, but very quickly I realized the way to come, that I came around was, this story is told in first person. So the boy is narrating and then he has dialogue. And I had basically to take a lot of that dialogue out and put it into translation for the Spanish version. So he could keep telling us his story without telling us, the words get stuck in my throat and then a dialogue in Spanish, you know what I mean? So, that was the biggest obstacle, for this particular one.
Excellent. This is fascinating. So we teased a little bit about what the book's about. Let's get into who is this young man who's having trouble speaking Spanish?
Yes, this young man, his name is Max. And the book is about him. So he comes from a bilingual household. And he refuses to speak Spanish, unfortunately, and mainly because his cousins, who are always around, tease him because of his accent, but mainly because he cannot roll his R's. And but the main problem is he adores his grandma, and his cousins and Max, they're all there every Sunday at grandma's house, and Max adores baking with his grandma, but his grandma does not speak English. So they get around the language barrier because grandma has a very talkative parrot and a bilingual parrot and a translator parrot named Lorito. So Lorito goes back and forth, just squawking the recipes. So in the book, you'll read Lorito going like, leche, azúcar. So the book has that humorous component as well, that readers could squawk out the very few Spanish words that are sprinkled throughout. And it all comes down to, at one point, Max and Abuela have to bake a very important bake to compete at the county fair. And that day, Lorito is nowhere to be found, and Max and Abuela are faced to figure out how to communicate with each other. And yeah, readers will see Max realizing that his Spanish doesn't have to be perfect to be beautiful and understood. And they'll even get to see Abuela try a little English. Oh. So yeah, it's I guess it's a book about overcoming language barriers, but it's also about making mistakes and how important it is to just try.
Yeah. Max's story reminds me a lot of my daughter. When she was growing up, she had Alejandra had the hardest time rolling her R's, and she tried and tried and tried. Finally got it. But both of my kids, they grew up in a bicultural home and a bilingual home. Well, I'm not fluent, but hearing a lot of Spanish, spending lots of time with their Spanish-speaking grandparents and uncles. And so they're able to understand a lot, but they don't have the confidence to speak in Spanish. Unlike me, who I don't have their Spanish ability, but I have no problem going out and making a fool of myself speaking in Spanish.
I love that, yeah. And in my this book is very much inspired by my own family, but like you said, I found a lot of people coming to me and saying, I couldn't roll my R's, because even Spanish speakers, a lot of us have trouble rolling the R's, and some even, some have to go to speech therapy because that's a problem. So yeah, this one also comes very close to my own family, I guess, since you already caught the whole parrot being a translator. And my mom doesn't speak English, and she, like your kids, that she understands English perfectly. You can tell she understands English perfectly, but she won't try. And my kids are a lot better now. They're just like, okay, we have to speak in Spanish. But yeah, my son went through a very specific phase where he's like, I know it doesn't sound right. I'm gonna be made fun of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that's a big thing with kids that come from bilingual families. It's that while they're really strong in one language, and they're afraid, they don't want to be made fun of in trying to speak the other language. How do you think, other than just waiting till you're almost 100 years old and not caring about what other people think, which is where I'm kind of at in my life, how can we help kids get more confidence and not worry? I understand that you're going to make mistakes, and you make mistakes in English too. It's not a big deal. It's not the end of the world.
Exactly. I think hopefully it will get better, because I think it's this idea of there's a big spectrum in being bilingual, right? Because even being able to understand something and not speaking it perfectly, you're bilingual. I mean, even I don't know if they do this now, but back in the days when you had your work CV and you were applying for a job, it would say, do you speak another language? And then it would ask you at what level. Because no matter what, I think the main thing for families is I would say two things. One, in a very particular bilingual home where you really are trying, your main goal is to try for a relationship to not, I guess, like in this case, it's the grandmother and the grandson. If it's more about a relationship thing, I want him to know the culture, or be closer to the grandma, I think what was my inspiration for the book is just finding other ways, because communication and bonding doesn't just have to be language. So going out for walks, and even if someone speaks in English and the other person speaks in Spanish, board games, video games, just finding that common ground, baking. But then more about the very personal self-conscious of like, just go for it. It will be so valuable for your life, to be able to communicate in another language. I think it's just kind of normalizing it. And, with books like this or other types of ways that the kids can see themselves and see like, okay, this kid is out there and speaking and trying. I know one thing that has helped my kids is my husband, he's from Iowa, and his Spanish is high school Spanish. And he does the same thing as you. He's like, I'm just going to try. And, they see the relationship that he has, how it's elevated that he has with the rest of my family when he just tries, and they are so excited for it. They'll just keep talking to him in Spanish and very nicely, if they have to correct him because they didn't understand, it's not in a way that is negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mentioned here on the podcast that I was part of a tour, Clowns Without Borders tour, down to El Salvador. I spent the month of November touring the beautiful nation of El Salvador. And for some reason, I don't know how this happened, but for some reason, the only guy who wasn't fluent in Spanish in our performing troupe became the MC and the master of ceremonies. And so I would introduce everybody, and in rehearsal, as we're building the show, I wanted to say, we are Clowns Without Borders, payasos sin fronteras. And I made a mistake, and I very enthusiastic, I'm having trouble with English right now.
Right.
I very enthusiastically said, somos payasos sin frentes. And my troop mates laughed at me. I'm like, oh, what's so funny about that? And they explained that I was saying forehead. But they loved it, and we kept it in the show. And so I went around El Salvador saying, somos payasos sin frentes. And it was a great joke.
That's amazing. Yeah, right. There has to be a little bit of laughing at yourself sometimes, right?
I think that's one of the, this isn't the subject of this particular book or conversation, but I think learning how to laugh at yourself is such a valuable skill. And I think over the last 10, maybe 20 years, in an effort to kind of help people stop bullying each other, we've kind of lost that. And we don't tell kids, it's just laugh. You made a mistake. No big deal. Life goes on.
Exactly. I have a saying that has kind of become a thing in our family. And it's, because inevitably even a loved one or anyone will tell you like, what did you do? You did this or that, whatever. And sometimes it is more of a bullying kind of, you can't help it, but they spotted something. Or sometimes it's an actual mistake that you made. And I started this sometime in college when I just felt like back and forth. I couldn't get things right. And I would just I would just say out loud, oh, I forgive myself. And then a friend of mine said, oh, well, I don't have anything to say about if you forgive yourself, what can I do? So now it's a thing in our family that we're like, oh, I just forgive myself. And then you just go and clean up the mess, and I think there's a lot of resilience with just laughing it off, and forgiving yourself. Yeah.
I love that. I think I'm going to start using that.
Good.
Tell me, you mentioned that you translate books from English to Spanish. Do you ever do the reverse?
I have not yet. I just found, I started doing first, academic resources, for nonprofit organizations. And then, there was this, big push to have the Spanish version of a book for the U.S. market. And that just has happened to be the network that I am in right now. I think, it's beautiful. I know a lot of translators who they not only translate books into English, but they really get to know the literature, the international literature that's out there and that's winning prizes. So they would even go to a publisher and say, this beautiful book is, taking the Spanish speaking market by storm, and you could be interested in it, and I can translate it. So that would be something, that I would be interested in as well. Yeah. But right now I'm doing English into Spanish and, having lots of fun with it. I think my niche right now is sometimes doing, rhyme or lyrical, because I can really play around with that Spanish where I'm really translating the meaning of the story and not have to use the exact words.
Yeah. That is a chore. Taking something that rhymes in English or any language and then translating it into a different language.
Yeah, exactly. I went to, what was a career fair at my children's school, and I was explaining this translation that I do, and they're like, oh, but there's Google Translate. And I was like, well, yes. And the problem is that's word by word, and it will get you the gist of what it is, but it won't be the same experience. And I think one of my goals for sure, or missions, or as a translator is, that keeps me grounded is, that as I'm translating from English to Spanish, I want to elevate the Spanish language because it's for the U.S. market too. I want people who speak Spanish to feel proud. And if something is of good quality and is in Spanish, you are proud of that book or the movie or something, versus if it's poorly translated, the Spanish speakers will understand it, but they will be very much able to know that this was translated, that this was like, it. So here it is so you can understand, and not really the respect of like, here it is for you readers. So I think that's one of the reasons why there still needs to be the human translators.
Yes, well, yes, Google Translate and all those, they're much better than they were 30 years ago when I tried to translate my show into Spanish to tour Puerto Rico. But they're still not there yet.
Yeah. And especially with a book in rhyme or a book in lyrical, for things like that. But yeah, they're really good at being able to translate I don't know, like a letter or for understanding.
Yeah. Interesting. I attended the International Children's Book Festival in Bologna, Italy. And what an experience. First, I was very surprised to find out that children aren't allowed at the Children's Book Festival in Bologna, Italy, because it's a marketplace where publishing houses are selling the rights to their books to publishers in other regions, other parts of the world. I think one of the things that people don't realize is typically when an author sells their rights to a publisher, they're not necessarily selling the worldwide rights. They're selling you can publish this book in the United States, United Kingdom, and that's it. And it's just a fascinating business, this business of books.
Yeah, that's right. In my case, I did sell world rights, but when we were translating Squawk of Spanish into Spanish, they had to tell me, this is for the U.S. market. And even then, if they were going out to the X market, I don't even know if they would call it, it's just like U.S., UK. They wouldn't just call it Hispanic market. I think they would say South America or Spain, Mexico, and the Caribbean because of all the different Spanish. And I even, because they even said, we had a conversation about the title. And because I got to translate the inside of the book and I was not able to translate the title. And I said, I think I can come up with catchier titles. And they said the title is something that we do with Spanish speakers, but we do in another department. And it is depending on what we want, on our audience, basically, and what we want our audience to get. And in this case, they wanted to translate the title as, what's that word? As like word for word as possible. Because they were much more interested in the school and library market in the United States for that one Spanish.
Interesting.
Edition. Yeah. It's fascinating. And it takes so many people.
Yeah. And, as you were speaking, I imagine, because, and we spoke about this the last time we were together, Spanish is very different in different parts of the world. The Spanish spoken in Spain is different than Mexico, then it's different in Chile, and everywhere in the Spanish-speaking world, they will say that Puerto Ricans don't speak Spanish. But regardless of that, you're translating for a Hispanic audience from all of those different parts of the world. Is that an especially challenging thing for you?
Yes, if they don't tell me, I always ask. And in this case, it's usually I want to get as much directive as possible, and if not, I ask anyway because it gets them thinking, and we have like a clear basis on what I'm translating for. So in this case, in the case of Squawk of Spanish, it was U.S. market, so what they call neutral Spanish, and obviously no Spanish can be neutral, but what would be the most recognized word? And if it has to be between words that are too regional, then it would fall back to basically what I would be more comfortable in, since I was the author. And it's a book about bilingual, multicultural household. There's not a cultural Panama component, but they could fall back into that. Like, we chose this because our author is from this specific culture. But yeah, it's a thing. And usually the translator, or me in this case, if I'm translating other books, I would highlight those parts where it could go more than one way. And we would have a conversation about what would be the best to service the reader.
Excellent. Yeah. This really is fascinating. I'm curious. When I speak to illustrators here, I oftentimes ask them, what did you think the moment you get a manuscript? And, do some manuscripts, kind of attract you more than others? And they tell me, yes, absolutely. When you're translating another work, do you get really excited when you pick up the manuscript, or are some manuscripts like, I don't know if I want to do this one?
Yeah. Yes. There has been. I always kick myself if I don't take the time to really look at it before going in for a project. Sometimes I would just kind of look at it and say yes. And so what gets me the most excited is I go for a little bit of a challenge. I like books my favorite are books that are fun to read aloud, because you get to play with that and you make them fun to read aloud in Spanish. And then you get a little bit of a creative license, like, well, we changed this because it will make for a much more fun sounding word, and it's, almost the same. So I like that. And then, my favorite, but sometimes I don't know this until the back end, is when, I do ask what support I'm going to get. So whether it's, a reader, like a professional reader, or an editor, so that I can make sure that if my name's going to be in a book, it's going to be a good quality book. Early on in my career, I would just take as much as I could. And it happened one time with a book that when I received the final product, and this was a book in rhyme, and some of the pages I recognized, this is my translation, and then you would pass the page, and it was something very similar to a Google translation that did not rhyme. And so now I very much say that it's not my book, but if basically I would get a final look, and if there are discrepancies, they could just not use my name.
Interesting.
So yeah, there are things like that as well. And I'm sure for illustrators, they get an editor and things like that as well. But illustration is such a big part of a book. And I think there's still a little bit with translation. There's still a little bit of struggle of getting through to the big higher ups to say, well, this is really important too, the quality, and you can't just hire a translator and like not do even a little bit of what the author gets. The authors, we get several rounds of revision and readers and copy editors, and don't need as much, but you do. It's always nice to feel that you have that backup to make sure everything looks good.
Yeah. We should tell everybody where they can go to find out more about a Squawk of Spanish and more about you.
Yeah, well, there's always my website, which is writebetween.com, write as in writing, so WRITEBETWEEN.com. And I am on social media as well as at @write_between in Instagram and X, I guess.
Yeah. Awesome.
And yeah, the Squawk of Spanish comes out August 13th. And Un Graznido en Español, which is the Spanish version, comes out August 13th as well.
Awesome. We've had a great time speaking to the author of Squawk of Spanish, the new bilingual book, or the two versions coming out in August from our guest, Gabriella Aldeman. Gabriella, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Ed. This is great.
This episode of Reading with Your Kids is sponsored by Ken. Beautiful book written by Carolyn Nunez Vasquez. Hey, what do bears, foxes, eagles, deers, coyote, rabbits, and nature have in common? Well, they all teach human beings important lessons. And when humans learn to pay attention to nature, we all learn much about living in harmony. All animals have a kinship to each other. We can all learn from others, bringing the message home that even though people come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, we are all part of one human family, and therefore we are all kin. Check this book out today. It's filled with beautiful, beautiful folklore that teaches kids lessons for life. Before we invite our guest into the studio, I would love to invite you to visit a very special website. It's clownswithoutborders.org. Clownswithoutborders.org. This is a group that I absolutely adore. I am part of Clowns Without Borders, and I had the honor of being part of the 2023 tour of El Salvador. I had so much fun joining with artists from all over the world to bring a smile to people who really needed it and really appreciated it too. And we would love for you to join us as a monthly Joy Maker. The Joy Makers, they're a family of people just like you who love to laugh and make other people feel good. So please take a moment and visit clownswithoutborders.org and consider joining me as a Joy Maker. Join us right now from the United Kingdom. Our guest is here today to celebrate his brand new children's book. Is called Be a Scribe. Please welcome to the show a scribe himself, Michael Hoffen. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Doing very well. How are you?
I am wonderful. I'm really excited to speak to you. This is a pretty impressive project. It would be impressive if anybody did this, but the fact that, well, I don't want to tell your age, but could you let everybody know how old you are?
I just turned 17 this March.
Just turned 17. And you started working on this project
in, I believe, the summer of 2020. I mean, that's when I started learning hieroglyphs. And then in the summer of 2021, I began writing the book. Okay. So that was 3 years ago now.
So 14 years old, you're translating hieroglyphics.
Yes.
So that just, I mean, if my head explodes at any point during this conversation, it's just that I'm amazed. So Be a Scribe. Tell me, this is based on some ancient Egyptian texts. Am I right about that?
Yes, it is. It's based on essentially a text written 3,500 years ago by an Egyptian scribe named Khedi. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the text is actually about. So the text is about a father and a son, and the father's a miner, and they're traveling down the Nile, or up the Nile actually, to the capital of Egypt. And the father wants to enroll his son in scribal school because he wants to give his son a chance at a better life. You know, he's a miner, but he wants his son to have a higher social position. So he wants his son to go to school essentially. And along the way, he tells his son about all the other jobs that his son could have if he doesn't get to become a scribe. You know, he says, you know, you could be a woodworker, or you could be a leather worker. And these are all the reasons why you don't want to be these jobs and why these jobs are really bad and you should never want them. And then he says, oh, but the job of the scribe is the best of all. And it's the best job you could possibly want. You should study really hard in scribal school so you get this job. That's essentially the basis of the text. And at the end, the father tells his son about a bunch of wisdom that he thinks will be relevant for him in the capital. You know, he says things like, you shouldn't eat to excess, or you should respect your father and your mother. I think it's interesting that many of these things we're still hearing today.
Yeah, and just the whole premise that, you know, a dad wants his child to have a better life than he had, that's also a kind of universal and still existing dream I know for me, I want my kids to have a better life than I had.
Yes, no, I think it's a very universal trait.
So this document that is thousands of years old, was this a piece of fiction, or was it actually a letter the father was writing to his son?
Well, I mean, you can think about it either way. You can think about it as a piece of fiction, because the father presents himself as a miner, but it's highly unlikely that a miner would know how to read and write in those days. And so it's somewhat doubtful that way. And also, an interesting fact, I didn't actually put this in the book, so it's a little bit exclusive, but this is, of course, just a conjecture, but there have been many Egyptian kings named Pepi, and Pepi is the name that the father gives his son in the story. So it's possible that maybe he was creating this as somewhat of a fiction and saying, you know, if you study hard in scribal school, look what you can achieve. You can be the pharaoh. Again, this is all conjecture. It's probably not true, and Pepi was just chosen as a random name or as a common Egyptian name. But it's a bit like saying, you know, it's a bit like telling the story of the childhood of Abraham Lincoln or something like that, or George Washington and calling him George. Something, you know, that's essentially a comparison. But it's conjecture really. So it could be fiction, but it could possibly be real. It could be a true story. It could be that Khedi's writing it, the scribe's writing it about someone named Khedi, not about himself.
Uh-huh. This is, I'm blown away. I'm blown away by so much. First off, that, you know, we've gone from hieroglyphics being written on parchment and carved into papyrus. And, you know, now we're talking over Zoom. You're on the other side of the ocean and we can see each other, hear each other. So technology has advanced incredibly, but human nature, not so much.
I know, it's interesting. And you also have the example of the fact that Khedi wants a better life for his child, but also the fact that many of the same values that Khedi sees as important, like respect, not eating to excess, not being gluttonous, are still things that we value today. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. You know, of course, it's great that technology has advanced, but I think it's still, you know, it's still pretty good that respect is valued.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, what makes a 14-year-old interested in translating hieroglyphics?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I'd always loved history. And when I was really young, I used to read this book. It was called The Usborne Encyclopedia of World History. That's Usborne with an E. I highly recommend you get it. It's an amazing book. But it doesn't focus on ancient Egypt. It focuses on, you know, the whole swath of human history. And it's illustrated, it's detailed. I read it, I think I started reading it maybe I was around 9, 10 years old. And that's the book that really sparked my interest in history, because it made me fascinated with how people lived in ancient times. And so ever since then, I'd loved history. And then early in 2020, I'd heard of this summer course that my future co-author, Christian, was teaching. about hieroglyphs, and I was really interested. I was intrigued. I wanted to take it. But unfortunately, because of COVID, it didn't happen. And because of COVID, luckily though, I had a lot of spare time. And so I decided to start learning hieroglyphs, and that's really where it all began. I reached out to Christian, and he agreed to start teaching me hieroglyphs, and that's where it started.
We should mention your co-authors. They're not your everyday picture book writers. They're respected Egyptologists?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your co-writers.
Sure. So Christian is one of my co-writers, and he's the one that I already mentioned, the one who actually taught me hieroglyphs. And then Jen is my other co-author, and she's been absolutely amazing. And Christian introduced me to her. They both studied Egyptology together at Brown. And Christian introduced me to her and talked about, and that's sort of where the project began.
Wow. How did you find this document?
So essentially, this is actually one of the more famous, texts. This is a text that was copied a lot by Scribes. So the main copy that I used for translation was a copy called Papyrus Salier, which is in the British Museum, named after a French collector of Egyptian antiquities. But there are also a few ostraca, and essentially what ostraca are, they're little pieces of pottery that a scribal student would write on to practice. So just like you're practicing your handwriting when you're in school doing those little activities. I remember doing those when I was younger. Scribal students might practice their Egyptian writing on little pieces of pottery, because papyrus is very expensive to make, but pottery fragments were pretty cheap. And then, they might throw them away after a while. And we found archaeologists have found a lot of, ostraca pointing to, ostraca of little fragments of the text. And so it was Egyptologists know that it was a pretty well copied text, and it's a famous text in Egyptology. It's just because of its content. It's so interesting. And, so I feel like it was a pretty natural choice to choose, both for the fact, because it reminded me of my own experiences, and I thought it really, my parents or people that I know asked me, well, Michael, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I thought that it would be a great choice to present students with, because they could really relate to it, and they could see their own experiences represented in this text.
Yeah. Well, you kind of reminded me of a question I should ask. Michael, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Okay. I mean, to be honest, I think I still have a lot of time. Thankfully, I am, of course I'm in school, but I'm not being pushed into any one career path, too early. I mean, of course, an Egyptologist is still always on the line, or a professional author as well. But I think it's really too early to say.
Yeah. And you are, in the United Kingdom right now. You live in New York, but you're in England for a special program. Am I right?
Yes. So I'm working with the Griffith Institute right now, and that's sort of the main center of Egyptology at Oxford University. And I'm helping them archive, and I'm analyzing and digitizing a photograph collection that was created by a late Egypt enthusiast from the 1980s to the 2000s, of major Egyptian landmarks and monuments, and it's pretty historically it's very historically significant. So it's fascinating work just to see these images, because they were donated after he passed away a few years back, I think around 2018, but the people who work at the Griffith Institute haven't really had time to really crack them open and put them in proper archival material and digitize them. So it's really fascinating to see these images, many of them for the first time since they were taken. Yeah.
Wow. This story is really incredible. Obviously, we can, I'm imagining families can have conversations about what we've already talked about the fact that human nature really hasn't changed that much, and that our Egyptians valued the idea of respecting others just as much as we do, and making healthy choices when it comes to eating. What other kind of conversations do you think families can have as they're reading your book?
Well, I think one big part of it, any learning history, at least for me, is, sort of fun details, fun facts that people might not know. So, like, for example, one of those is, did you know that the English alphabet, or the Latin alphabet technically, is actually derived from hieroglyphs? So it's a bit of a long story. I'll go into it right now. But so essentially, Egyptian miners were working in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, and there were also some miners from some Canaanite miners, and essentially these Canaanite miners from modern day Israel are essentially they couldn't understand the Egyptian inscriptions that they saw, but the hieroglyphs represented everyday objects, like you have a hieroglyph for a bull, for example, and they could recognize that it was a bull, but they didn't know that what the specific sound that it represented in the Egyptian language. And so they gave those hieroglyphs names from their language, and that's where they created their own alphabet from. So, for example, and that bull eventually got rotated and turned and simplified until it became our letter A. And if you turn the letter A upside down, you can actually see it's very rudimentary, but you can see it looks somewhat like a bull with two horns sticking out, which I think is quite fascinating because the alphabet's been rotated many times. But it's quite interesting to see how many of these letters how many of our letters were derived from the Egyptian alphabet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And the hieroglyphs, do they stand, like our language, stand for certain sounds that are put together that we have to decode? Or is it more like Mandarin where each symbol stands for a word, or each character stands for its own word?
So it's actually a mix. So most of the signs stand for a sound. And then there's a few that stand for, and at the end of each word, they usually have a sign that stands for an idea. So, for example, with the word for cat, it's actually funny. It's mew. That's another fun fact. just like a cat's meow. And you have the different sounds that look nothing like a cat. You have the M as an owl, and then you have the I as a reed leaf, etc. And then, but at the end of the word, you have a determinative that signals that it's the word cat, as opposed to just another word that sounds the same. That's called a determinative or a classifier. And then you also have certain sounds that, like you said, represent just entire words. So it's really a mix. And there's thousands of signs, most of them not used, but there's thousands of signs in the Egyptian language. So it's really it's quite complex. Yeah. I can't imagine being a scribe and having to learn it all.
I agree with you. I can't imagine learning any of it, to be honest with you. But tell me, do we still know what the ancient Egyptian language sounds like? Is it similar to what Egyptian sounds like today?
So not quite. No, I mean today I think most Egyptians speak Egyptian Arabic, which is descended from languages in the Arabian Peninsula. But we actually don't really know. And there's a few Egyptians, the Christian Egyptians speak mostly Egyptian Arabic, but also Coptic. And that is probably the language, the living language that's most closely related to ancient Egyptian. And most of the words are descended, but it's written using the Greek alphabet as opposed to hieroglyphs. Mm-hmm. But we don't actually know what the language sounded like, to be honest. We can make conjectures. Egyptologists can make conjectures from Coptic words. And the Coptic word sounds like this, so given these changes, it probably must have sounded like this back then. But to be honest, we really don't know. It's a mystery.
Yeah. It's a mystery to me how a 14-year-old can be so accomplished and so interested in history. You shared with us that you have this love of history. In school, do you find, and one of the things we've talked about on the podcast is that sometimes it seems like educators in textbooks go out of their way to make history uninteresting and boring. Do you find that in school? Or are you just as fascinated with, the history you're learning in school as opposed to the history that you're encountering through your curiosity?
I like both kinds of history, but I will say that I don't think they go out of the way to make it boring. But I will say that sometimes they place less emphasis on on daily life and more on the larger trends of history, which is of course no less important. But I think what really grabs students' attention is at least for me, is understanding how did people live back then and what were their lives like. And then I think once you get them interested in that part of history, I think it's much easier, at least for me, to get them interested in the great trends and, understanding how we got here. What are the major aspects of the 20th century, just as an example. Those sort of big, huge questions that to wrestle with. I think kids are more interested in that if they are first introduced to aspects of history like daily life.
Awesome. We should tell everybody where they can go to find out more about Be a Scribe and find out more about you, because you're a pretty fascinating guy.
Thank you.
And is there a website, or are you on social media where folks can find you?
We do have a website. It's called beascribe.com. And then we do have Facebook and Instagram accounts, and they're linked to that website as well.
Awesome. We've had a really fascinating time speaking to the author of Be a Scribe. His name is Michael Hoffen. Remember that name, because I think our young man is going to be doing some amazing things in the future. This won't be the last we hear from him. Michael, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Reading with Your Kids and will join us for the next exciting episode of the show. We also hope that if you love this episode of the show, that you take some action for us. First, follow us on social media, facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, @readingwithyourkids on Instagram, and @JedleyMagic on X. We would also absolutely love it and be so grateful if you could leave us a review on whatever podcasting platform you find us on. We're especially looking for more reviews on Spotify. That seems to be the real leader in podcast downloads these days. So if you could take a moment and tell folks around the world that you love Reading with Your Kids. Help us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. We'd also love for you to visit our YouTube channel, youtube.com/readingwithyourkids. You can find all of our STEM is Family Fun and Drawing with Your Kids videos on our YouTube channel. Of course, our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Great place to find out more about Pisa Loves Bella, our latest certified great read, and all the certified great reads. We like to call it our certified great read wall of fame. You can also use the contact button there at readingwithyourkids.com to let us know what you love about the show. Let us know what we could be doing better, and we'd really love to hear who you would like to hear on a future episode of the podcast. It was my son, Christopher, who suggested that I reach out to LeVar Burton many years ago and invite him on the show, and who would have thunk it? He said yes, and that really helped Reading with Your Kids take off. Who knows? The person that you would love to hear in the show, we can reach out to that person and do our best to have that person on. You can also give me a chance to ask that person a question on your behalf. So check it out. You can do that all at readingwithyourkids.com. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Michael Hoffen. Please be sure to check out Be a Scribe. I'm still in awe. A 14-year-old translating hieroglyphics. And also, please be sure to check out my friend Gabriella Aldeman. Squawk of Spanish is her brand new book. I want to thank my amazing team, Fatima Khan, Chris Doherty, Rory Grady, Judy Hu, Stella Sheree, Hannibal Sanj, Alyssa Montiero, Julia Lipman, Devin Hill. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place. And you do that every time you read with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next episode of Reading with Your Kids.